Welcome to the WODcast podcast. I'm your host, Eddie Ift. This is the show where we love fitness, but we talk about it more than we do it. I am here with my new guru, Ashley Reaver, who I reached out to this company because rather than work really hard and do what I'm supposed to, I like other people to do it for me. So I found this company called Inside Tracker that basically does your blood work and then analyzes it all and sees where you have deficiencies and where you need to work and how you can become healthier. And it opened up a whole new way for me to distract myself from doing my job because there's so much fun stuff here. And we're going to go over it in this episode. I'm going to try to stay away from being personal, but I'll use myself as an example at times. But, you guys that listen to the show know how much I like to talk about myself. So this is kind of perfect. But I'm doing this because I want to help you guys. Because like I've said before, I think everyone that gets into this kind of world needs a DEXA scan and needs blood work done. And so I chose, rather than my doctor, Inside Tracker, because my doctor, I hope she never listens to this. She fights with me about everything that I want to talk about and goes, you going to open up this wormhole now? And I'm like, yeah, I am, because I want to fix it. And she's like, just do what you're doing. You're fine. I'm like, no, I'm not. I had high numbers here. So Ashley works with Inside Tracker. And what's your title, Ashley, there?
I am the lead nutrition scientist at Inside Tracker.
And you come from like a sports background, correct? Like a sports
I am a sports dietitian. Yep. Personally, I like to think I'm very athletic as well.
What sports do you like?
So I was doing CrossFit until I live in California, and now that's not an option. But I also have been into triathlons for the past couple of years. So it's been nice to switch 6 months of CrossFit, then go to 6 months of training for. My past 2 races were half Ironmans.
Oh,
wow.
I
don't think I'm going to go for a full one, but.
You got to. I'm going to try it this year.
I just can't talk myself into that much exercise.
It's really, that's the hard part for me, the boredom of training. Mm-hmm. And I
do think if there's a way to run a marathon, though, it's like or train for a marathon, it's like as a small component of a lot of other stuff that I find appealing, but 12 hours or whatever it is a long time.
What do you rank as the most boring part of a triathlon?
Probably the bike.
Really? I think that's
had to entertain myself a lot on a bike.
I think the bike is the most fun because you're going faster, you can wreck, all that stuff. Swimming is so boring. You can't talk.
For me, I'm not good at it. So I like try and distract myself with like counting and breathing. That goes by a lot faster. On the bike though, like the last time I was trying to sing that Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, and I could not make it through all of the states. That's how bored I was.
Wow. That's why, like, when I train, it's not so bad because I listen to podcasts. I'll just go out and be like, oh my God, I've got 3 hours on the bike. I guess I'll just listen to an episode of Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
And it helps the time go by. And I wonder why we do this if it's so boring.
It's nice to check it off the list, honestly. I like trying to cram my schedule as much as possible and get stressed out about things. That's when I'm really achieving things.
I'm the same way. This whole pandemic, I've been so lazy. Like I still work out, but I'll think about it for like 20 hours and then I'll finally do it.
Yeah.
And those 20 hours that I thought about it, I did nothing.
Yeah.
I looked at the plan, looked at the workout, researched stuff about it. It's just 20 hours of procrastination until I do the workout. And sometimes it gets so late, I'm like, well, I guess I just missed that workout. We'll have to get ready for tomorrow now.
Yeah.
But if I have such little time and everything's crunched, I get so much done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have a hard time when this pandemic's over and everybody's like, okay, now you got to really do shit. And I'm like, but I've become a retiree.
Yeah.
I want to go play bocce.
I'm unsafe outside now. So
yeah. Well, so where was your CrossFit gym? Which one did you work out at?
That was Grassroots CrossFit in Berkeley, California.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a sweet little gym. Now I believe it's Grassroots Fitness.
Oh, one of those guys. They didn't like Greg Glassman.
Yeah. But I have not been back since March when all of this happened. You still can't go indoors anywhere in California. So
You may be surprised that when you go back, it's grassroots CrossFit again.
it might be.
Because everybody kind of jumped back on board. The new CEO seems like he's got his stuff together. So I think everyone. It wasn't like official, but I think a lot of people that de-affiliated re-affiliated.
I hope there was a discount for them to hop back in.
I hope so too, because they did pay the price. It was a difficult thing for them to go through. So, how long have you been a nutritionist?
I am coming up on 9 years. Since I passed to be a dietitian, you have to pass that national exam. So it's been 9 years since I passed that almost.
Okay. So you're like, in my experience, just talking to you the other day, you seem to be way more ahead of the curve than most dietitians I've talked to. Like, even in the hospital, like when my mom was in for pulmonary fibrosis and a lot of inflammation, a lot of this, a lot of that. And I saw that the diet the diet they had her on, they would show up with like her breakfast and it would be orange juice, muffins, Jello. And I'm like, hey, do you think you could get more sugar on this plate? Is it possible? And I would joke with them. I was like, hey, do you guys have any like chocolate cake or pudding, or do you just have sugar water? Do we have Kool-Aid? Can we give her some Kool-Aid? And they were like, we just need to get calories in her. We need to get calories in her. And I'm like, any chance you can get some good ones? Like, does it have to just be pure sugar? So, and I wondered about like where that mentality comes from of just calories in, who cares what they are?
Well, I think it depends on disease state.
Sure.
Like for sure, if you're not eating food, that puts your body into an insane amount of stress.
Mm-hmm.
So likelihood of you, especially if your body's already under stress, like if you're in the hospital.
Right.
So being in a massive caloric deficit just further increases that stress on the body.
Okay.
Certainly there would be better food options probably, but it also like kind of weighs on what you can actually get someone to eat. My first job was actually in hospital food service at a big hospital in Boston. And one of my favorite projects for my job was I had to come up with a menu of milkshakes for our oncology patients because we had to get anything appetizing into their body so they had a better response to their treatments. So it depends. A milkshake probably isn't something I'd recommend for everyone for a couple meals every single day, but for some people, it is really the lesser of two evils if it's calories in.
Because forgive me if I'm wrong, but isn't a lot of the problem with cancer is that it's cachexia, that people's like muscles are just degrading and they just need to get the calories.
They eat through themselves.
Okay. There's a doctor that I have studied for like a few years, Walter Longo out of USC, that has this fast mimicking diet that he's still getting the calories into people, but he's getting them to a fasted state so that they don't have any of the glucose or glycogen or whatever it is that fuels the tumors. And he's like, I've seen him on like the cover of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and everything because of the stuff he does. But I don't know his diet because he like keeps it hidden behind a paywall. But I've seen people write about it, and it's mostly like avocados and green powder.
Sure.
Yeah. But
you can do it if you can get someone that has zero appetite to eat avocado with green powder. Great. That's a good way to do it.
That's what he said. I listened to him in a podcast, and he said that was the hardest thing, was getting them, any oncology doctors, to let him do studies, because they're like, are you insane? Like, how are we going to, these people are already not eating. How do we get them to eat your horrible diet, like your horrible tasting diet? And he was like, let me prepare it for them and then let me do the study. Because at first he wanted to go with like fasting completely, like not eating. And the doctors were like, you're out of your mind.
Yeah.
But so I realized, listening to you the other day, that I'm an idiot. I know nothing. I know such a small amount of everything, but not a lot about anything. So I want this to just be an education for my listeners and also for me. If you could explain what Inside Tracker does exactly. I mean, I know myself, but it'll come better out of you.
Sure. So we are a personalized nutrition company that utilizes blood as well as physiological markers and genetic markers in order to make recommendations that are actionable for you to improve certain markers in your life, primarily connected to overall longevity, but certainly performance, injury, weight loss, whatever a specific goal might be. Essentially, we try and just distill the science down to actions that you can very specifically implement in your own life to make improvements or work towards whatever your ultimate goal is.
So if somebody comes to you guys and was like, I want to work with you, but I'm on a ketogenic diet, would you be able to work around that?
Yeah, so we do honor dietary preferences, even if we don't agree with them. We would definitely still make recommendations that fit within whatever dietary preference someone has picked. For example, there's still ways that you can get in fiber that doesn't necessarily come with a lot of carbohydrates with it as well. So those are the types of foods that we would make recommendations for, as opposed to oatmeal is probably one of our most recommended foods. If we can, we may try and convince you as to why certain foods are the best ones to add, but it's ultimately, we show you the foods that fit within your dietary preferences, and then you see the other ones that we would recommend. So it's ultimately up to someone. They have the information there if they want to stick with that preference or be swayed to maybe add in another food.
So give me an example of a food that would keep you on your ketogenic diet, but would be high in fiber.
Chia seeds are a really great one. So chia seed pudding, including that, can be not as beneficial most likely as eating a bowl of oatmeal for certain markers, but it is a great way to get in a lot of fiber that can have a big impact on your metabolic markers like cholesterol or your glucose level if that's high.
Okay, I need to know. I eat oatmeal probably 5 days a week, but not oatmeal. I eat steel cut oats because oatmeal is disgusting. Like those steel cut oats are delicious. Oatmeal is horrendous.
Steel cut oats are still oatmeal.
I don't know why that flake. It feels like wet frosted flakes or something. It's so gross. And my wife just recently messed up, went out and got oatmeal instead of steel cut oats. And I just figured it would be the same. And I started eating. I never criticize her cooking ever, ever, ever. And I just looked at her. I'm like, this is disgusting. It's like eating wet cardboard.
There is for sure a difference in texture.
Yeah.
But they're all the same for the most part. Steel cut oats are just like the most raw form kind of. Rolled oats have just been steamed and pressed so that they cook faster. Instant oats, they've removed some of that fiber and made it smaller just so it cooks faster.
And if you're buying it from one of those companies that's I don't know, whatever, the cereal companies, it's full of sugar too.
Or fake sugar. Yeah.
No, I'm it's so funny you say that because that's one of my go-tos in the morning. I used to eat too much fat, not enough protein, and not enough carbs. And I switched to a lot more protein, and I've added in carbs, but good carbs like sweet potato, steel cut oats, and rice, and even white potatoes sometimes. Because I feel and tell me if I'm wrong here, as someone that does exercise a lot, there's no way I'm going to pull it off doing a ketogenic diet.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could, but you're not going to be able to reach maximal efforts.
Right.
There's a few fuel sources that our muscles utilize. Basically, we can tap into using fat as a fuel source after about 2 minutes when you get into aerobic activity. But any sort of explosive power movement that lasts longer than 10 seconds, but less than 2 minutes, your only option there is carbohydrates to be able to sustain that. So if you're doing 400-meter runs, if you are, I don't know, some WODs I feel are a minute and 30 seconds, to have that sustainable fuel for a minute and 30 seconds.
Are you talking about my Fran time? Minute 30?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, did you? Oh, wait, you said over 10 minutes. Okay, that's where I'm falling in lately.
Yeah. I mean, your body can definitely slug through it, but you're already asking your body to do so much. Why are you also asking it to figure out its own way to fuel itself?
So if you were doing a ketogenic diet and like that was, you were having that difficulty and you were trying to slug through, where's that going to show up in your blood work?
In your blood work?
Yeah.
Like in response to exercise, or just in general on your blood work?
Well, like you told me, I had high creatine kinase, was it? And
Yep.
and also a high sex binding hormone. What's it called? Sex
hormone binding globulin. Yeah.
Yeah, and you said, was it, which one of those could possibly be? Is it the creatine kinase that's from kind of pushing too hard and doing too much and overtaxing my system?
Yeah, so creatine kinase is an enzyme that naturally lives in your muscles. And anytime you train, the point of training is to cause muscle damage so that your muscles are repaired and either grow or get stronger, whatever the goal may be. So anytime there's some sort of muscle damage, you're going to see that in your bloodstream or in your blood results. I would imagine that on a ketogenic diet, you would see a lower creatine kinase because you wouldn't be able to sustain a high level of like repetitions. So you couldn't get as much muscle damage. Therefore, you wouldn't see as much creatine kinase in your bloodstream or get as much of a benefit out of those workouts that fall within that like 30-second to 2-minute range.
So after somebody gets their blood work done and they see their levels where they are, because I saw, I had a couple things that I was at risk and some that I was moderately at risk and then others that I was like right in the right place. So you see this, then is it your job to give the nutritional like advice back to the people? I mean, you've set up like a formula for it basically.
Yeah. So we have an algorithm that takes there's a super extensive questionnaire that we also collect. So we have all of that information about how you're exercising, sleeping, supplementing, or the foods that you eat. And based on that information, plus like your age, your gender, your ethnicity, that's how we figure out what like the right zone is for you for these markers.
Right.
So if you are a weightlifter, we would expect that your creatine kinase is much higher than someone that only engages in walking. But all of those inputs go into our proprietary system, which is called Segterra X. And that's really where we take research that we found and then translate that into like actionable things that you could do. So you're not going to get the same results as someone that never does resistance training because your creatine kinase is likely high for different reasons if somebody else doesn't do resistance training. But so my job with Inside Tracker originally was coming up with a lot of these recommendations. Now we have 6 total dietitians on staff, which is really nice. So some of that responsibility is spread around a little bit more. Now we have a great science team that also includes exercise physiologists and genetics, or geneticists that also are responsible for their own segments of our recommendations.
Yeah, I found it really neat that on your site you can switch from what your priorities are, if it's building muscle or if it's longevity or if it's overall health or whatever it is. And if I would replug it in to check mine, and I would see like one would say, hey, you need to keep taking your curcumin every day. And one would say, because I had a different goal, it was like, stop taking curcumin every day.
Yeah.
and I found that really interesting. It was like, as much as like we talked about it the other day, everybody should be thinking of overall health. But, that ego gets in there and you're like, but I want to get stronger.
Yeah.
And it changes completely, like what your goal should be, what you should work on. And I saw that and I was like, oh. One of the things I noticed that I think is really important that everybody out there knows is that there was so much of like almost like back off I'm a big fan of meat, of red meat, grass-fed red meat. And there was a bit of like back off of that and add more fish.
Yeah.
And it seemed like there were so many fish recommendations, but they weren't like, when I eat fish, it's like, okay, halibut. What else am I going to have? Halibut, maybe some tuna, halibut, tuna, halibut. This was like, add mackerel, add sardines, add, all different kinds of fish. And even
Yeah.
the same with meat too, like add your liver, which I'm like, I'd rather. But I get it. Like they're more nutrient dense, and that's what you have to
They're
do.
all based on nutrients that are tied to biomarkers that you have some area of improvement for. So halibut might show up if your vitamin D is out of the optimal zone, but if let's say your HDL or your magnesium or your cortisol is out, a different type of fish would be the one that's most recommended for you.
Now, are people's cortisol going to go up due to stress on the body, or like, is that like the mental stress?
So cortisol, I love. It's a lot of things. I feel like I tested my blood before I started working for Inside Tracker, and cortisol is what sold me on the company. And I think it just does a great job of two things: showing how your mental health has a serious physiological impact, meaning that what you are thinking has a big impact on your body. But two, it shows, I like to think of it as like the softer sides of training. So if you're overtraining, if you're not eating enough, if you're not sleeping enough, if you're stressed out for the millions of reasons that people can be stressed out, that's going to impact that cortisol level. So you could be like doing all of your workouts fine, but if you're not doing all of those other things associated with training, that's going to come back and have a big impact on your body as well. And that's because cortisol's main role, it sounds crappy now, but is basically to be able to break down protein in particular, to some extent fat, and convert that into glucose that your muscles can and brain can hopefully use to help you run away from a dangerous situation. That's why it's our fight or flight hormone. Obviously, if you're working really hard in the gym to build muscle mass at the same time that you are stressing yourself out, not eating enough calories, not getting any sleep, the cortisol level being high is breaking down all of that muscle that you're working so hard to build. So it's really counterintuitive to be stressing yourself out or your system out with all of these other things and only focusing on your workouts, not putting so much emphasis back on this overall cortisol level too.
So you guys test, what is it, like 43 markers?
We do test a lot, yeah.
Yeah. So when I went to get the blood test done, it was the simplest thing in the world. I went to Quest Laboratories, and I walked in. I was like, I don't want to be in a doctor's office and blah, blah, blah. And this is probably where everybody goes to get their COVID test. So I'm like around it. I walk in, they have this computer. It's like, put your name in and your phone number, and we'll text you when it's time for you. And they're like, go sit in your car. And I was like, oh, this is easy. 7 minutes later, I get this text. And they're like, come in. I walk right in the door. And I talked to the woman. I said, so are you doing a lot of COVID testing? And she's like, we do it. But she's like, we don't let people in if they're sick. Like, they check my temperature. She's like, you can't come here for a test if you're sick. And so she's like, the only people that would get tested are maybe some asymptomatic people that, don't know they have it. But you're there for such a brief time. Everybody's masked. And she drew my blood. It was so easy. And then I just kept seeing her fill up these vials. And I'm like, oh my God, they're testing everything. It was just one prick. But then I saw her fill up like 6 different vials or something. And I was like, wow, this is more than my doctor does.
Well, it seems like it's a lot of blood too, but it is a pretty small amount of blood.
Yeah, tiny amount.
I think it's like 50 milliliters is what it ends up being, which is, you're going to challenge my math at the moment. A fifth of a cup, basically, of fluid. So
I have no idea. No, Siri. I don't need to think anymore. I have Siri. I just ask Siri, and she tells me everything. But I was in, I think, it felt like 5 minutes. I was in and out of this place. And then you guys do all the stuff for it, which is great. Like they just send it away to you. And then I got the results. I think it was just a few days later or something. But what I wanted to know about that is, so if I got my blood tested, you have to fast before you get a blood test. But if I got it tested like 3 times in a week, how much of a variation could there be in those blood tests?
So it depends. It's marker specific. Like some markers can change, like based on what you ate, or how hydrated you are. But some of your other markers, we would not expect to see a big change over really a couple of weeks or months. With every blood test, that includes the ones you get with your doctors, there's a 10% margin of error just based on the testing technique, I suppose, or how they run the samples. But that's consistent across, like that's an industry standard. So theoretically, there could be a 10% swing from just a couple of days. We've also had people that test like the same time at their doctor's office. And then later they go and get a test from us for some reason. And they're not like drastically different, but sure, they're not going to be exactly like on the nail the same. Most markers, again, are pretty consistent over the course of a week. Some markers are going to fluctuate a lot more, like your sodium marker. If you head into one test and you're super dehydrated, it's going to be really high. If you chug a ton of water before your next test, it's probably going to be a little diluted or low.
Speaking of sodium, I've talked to a couple nutritionists on the show here in the past that it just seems like their big talking point now is the sodium potassium pump, and talking about getting enough sodium, getting enough potassium, getting enough magnesium. And that's like they all kind of hammered that through, this sodium, potassium, magnesium. And it's just weird. It's counter to what you've always heard your whole life about sodium. And now they're like, no, you need tons of sodium. I mean, Stan Efferding, who is like the strongest bodybuilder in the world, was telling me 1,000 milligrams of sodium before you work out, 1,000 after if you're like a top athlete, and everyone else 500. And I was like, that's a ton of sodium. And he's like, yep, and you need it. And he said, especially if you're eating a good diet with no processed food, because you're not getting sodium anymore.
Yeah. I mean, the vast majority, about 80% of sodium in the diet comes from processed foods or restaurant takeout foods. What you add to foods with a salt shaker makes up about 20% of what you're going to add. So if you're not eating processed foods now, you're not eating restaurant or takeout foods as often. Likely you're consuming less sodium than the vast majority of people. For an active population, I'd say that's probably an okay thing to consider. If you're sweating regularly, sodium is the primary electrolyte you're losing in your sweat. Obviously, you want to replenish that. Regular people, though, are blowing sodium out of the water if they're consuming a lot of processed or packaged foods. I'd say what's also just super important with sodium is making sure that you're drinking enough water. In general, if you are consuming a high amount of sodium and you're not drinking very many fluids, that's going to have some negative implications. If you're consuming a high amount of sodium and you're drinking a lot of water, then the impacts of sodium aren't going to be like super drastic. I believe the vast majority of Americans are consuming more than double of what's recommended for sodium.
Wow.
And about half of what's recommended for potassium. So the focus should really be on trying to increase potassium in the diet as opposed to drink this olive juice or this pickle juice, really. That's really where the imbalance falls, is just that most people aren't eating enough fresh fruits and vegetables. Potassium is something that is much less available, basically gets degraded in any sort of processing. So because of how most Americans eat, that's also something that drastically falls off unless it's been added as a like additive or preservative in foods. Most people aren't getting enough of it.
You brought up the pickle juice. I have heard that a number of times by endurance athletes, that is their go-to to get enough sodium.
I like pickle juice, but I know plenty of people that think it's disgusting.
Have you done it in races?
I have not done it in races. I've had a pickle after a race, but I think a lot of people do it for cramping. There is like no scientific consensus as to why some people cramp and others don't. Maybe it's potassium, maybe it's overall hydration, but there's no like consistent thing that everyone cramps because they have too little sodium. I've certainly cramped when I lose a lot of sweat, but I'm a super salty sweater, which I think is just an important thing to note about yourself. If you're covered with a fine white dust after you exercise, then pickle juice is probably something that'd be good for you.
Yeah, I've gone to I was using a electrolyte replacement called Tailwind for a while when I've done a couple big races, and I used Tailwind, but it's full of sugar. I mean, it's sugar and salt. That's like basically what it is, that you're just stirring into water. And I have a new one that I've been doing. I believe Rob Wolf is the owner of the company, Rob Wolf from the Paleo Solution, which I think has like zero sugar, but it's got really good levels of sodium, potassium, and even magnesium. I think it's called LMT. I'm not sure, but It tastes pretty good. And I just started it last week and I really like it. It was weirdly recommended to my wife to do, to help her with like satiating and not having the cravings. But she, or not her, but what I wondered about that is, so magnesium, where do you get it? Is that just green leafy vegetables?
You find it a lot in nuts and seeds. Shellfish has a good amount of it. Some whole grains have a good amount of it. I think an important thing to think about a whole grain is it's pretty similar to an egg. The germ that's in the center of that whole grain is removed in processing. So if you go from brown to white rice, that germ that's in the center is similar to an egg yolk, and that it has like the majority of things that are needed in order for that to grow. So whole grains tend to have a fair amount of that magnesium in there as well.
So with the magnesium, that was another thing that was like recommended to me a lot by people. I went through a phase where I was having, I think it's benign fasciculations, like that. I was like twitching, my muscles were twitching, and everybody's like, you need to up your magnesium. You need to up your magnesium. And then I would say, but if I look at my magnesium on my blood panel, it looks normal. And somebody said to me, that's in your blood. How is it intercellular? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So we test both serum magnesium as well as RBC magnesium. And magnesium is very similar to calcium in the sense that basically your blood likes to maintain a certain level of it. And if you aren't eating enough of calcium or magnesium, it comes from the stores in your bones in order to maintain that blood level. So for most people, your calcium is always going to be in a normal zone. So is your magnesium. It would only like your calcium in particular would only drastically be high or low if you have some sort of endocrine issue happening. RBC magnesium, on the other hand, isn't susceptible. Well, I shouldn't say isn't susceptible, but isn't managed as tightly. So isn't as tightly regulated by like the blood-bone balance.
Okay.
So if your RBC magnesium, which is the amount of magnesium on your red blood cells, is lower, then that's a pretty good indication that you're not consuming enough magnesium, either in your diet in general, or to replace any losses that can happen if you're an athlete and you sweat magnesium out, because it's also an electrolyte.
And that's going to show up in the Inside Tracker test, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
RBC magnesium is something that we do measure.
Oh, so I'm glad about that one, because I was in a good zone there. I'm like, okay, but also I haven't been having the fasciculation, so maybe it is because I've been, focused on it and working on it and taking supplements and stuff like that. Which that's what's so good about, like I said, the difference between going to you guys and going to my doctor. My panels came back from my doctor, and she was just like, okay, and I was like, but I have a high. I think at the time I was considered almost pre-diabetic. And what's that, HB1AC or did I say that right? Yeah.
Yep.
And I was like, so what do I do? And she's like, well, it's a 90-day snapshot of your health. So, just get healthier. And I was like, cool.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the help.
And not to say bad things about doctors, but they are trained for triage to treat people that are sick. So like if you're a healthy person, you are the least of their worries, generally healthy, but also that's just not necessarily where their expertise or training lies necessarily.
Right. And so they don't like dealing with obsessive compulsive people like me that pester them on a daily basis. That's why there's services like Inside Tracker that I can log in every day and look at my blood work and look at what I have to do. I could bug the shit out of you guys. I mean, that's speaking of which, I will talk about something personal. My sex binding hormone globulin. Can you explain?
Sex hormone binding globulin.
Sex hormone binding globulin. Look, there's a couple words in there that I'm not liking. Sex and binding are not. If mine's bad, that's not good. And I don't understand it. I'm trying to understand. I've read about it and everything, but tell me if I'm wrong. It's basically, I've got a lot of testosterone. My testosterone levels are normal, but they're not binding with this hormone that delivers it. Is that correct?
Close, pretty close.
Okay.
So your testosterone is largely about 95% of it is bound to some sort of transporter in the body The primary transporters are this SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, and albumin. And once testosterone is bound to one of these transporters, it still shows up in your total testosterone pot, because that's what that 95% of total testosterone that you're seeing is. It's testosterone that's bound to a transporter. The free testosterone is not bound to anything, so it's free, essentially. If you have a higher amount of this transporter, this SHBG in your body, theoretically, you're going to have less free testosterone because more of it is going to be bound. So it shows in your total testosterone pot, but it's no longer free testosterone.
So it's not being used, or it's not usable, or what is it then?
So free testosterone, both testosterones are absolutely available. I kind of like to think of free testosterone as like testosterone that's most ready and able to jump in and help for things. It doesn't have to go through a process of kind of like uncoupling from one of these transporters. Overall, if your total testosterone level is higher, yours is still in a really great range. There isn't an issue with
you hear that, ladies?
Your free T is also still in a good range, but that elevation in SHBG is something that is expected if you have higher levels of testosterone, but is also something that we've seen can be higher if, similarly to cortisol, those kind of softer sides of training aren't necessarily being respected, I'll say. In particular, eating enough calories in general, getting enough rest, taking enough rest and recovery days. Those are things that we've seen, especially as we followed a lot of professional athletes through the course of their season.
Did you just call me a professional athlete? Oh my God.
Just an example. SHBG tends to creep up. Free T tends to drop. Cortisol creeps up. And that's just because, especially for like baseball and hockey, those two sports are just brutal.
Because
sleep debt.
I was just going to say, because of the sleep deprivation and the
so much travel. I have no idea how hockey players are allowed to play basically football games a couple times a week. I think that's probably the most brutal sport. So those are things that we have just seen in a lot of the athletes that we've tested throughout the course of their season.
I heard Matthew Walker, who's like a sleep expert who wrote this book on sleep, talk about athletes that they've tested, like away athletes versus home athletes, and the performance level is so much better of the home athlete because like sleeping in their own bed and being able to get a good night's sleep before the game, that sports like teams recognize this and like kind of made it a rule that they would travel like a couple days out before the game to prevent that from happening. But you can't do that with a baseball team or because they're going from one town to another town. And I could see that being just brutal. Is that seen a lot in CrossFitters?
I mean, if there's a sleep deprivation, maybe, but what we would see a lot of CrossFitters, if there's not enough rest and recovery in there, this is an unpopular belief, but you do not need to reach your max heart rate more than 3 times a week. Every other day is a good rule of thumb to really be pushing your heart rate up there. That is a massive stressor to your system. That can cause elevated levels of SHBG. If you haven't taken a rest for like a week off in months or years, as we've seen, that can cause that. Also, if you're not getting in enough calories to support your activity, that's another thing that we've seen elevating that SHBG level. In particular, we've seen that a lot with triathletes that are avoiding carbohydrates for whatever reason. Similarly, though, CrossFit athletes, depending on how active you are, require an insane amount of calories. It is just difficult to eat enough calories to support your activity and all of the functions you need to stay alive, with, cutting out where most people get 50% of their energy from each day.
So that brings me to, very importantly, I think that happens to me constantly, where I will eat all day long and feel like I got enough calories, and then late at night, I'm famished. And so the quickest, easiest thing to go to is sugar. And because I don't eat it all day long. And then at night, I know for some reason the craving is there. And I don't know if it's the sugar or the craving is calories. And the quickest way to get the calories is sugar. But it's it's hard for me during the day to force feed myself to say,
Sure.
I'm going to eat more meat. I'm going to eat more oats. I'm going to eat more, whatever, vegetables, whatever it is. It's difficult to do. So wouldn't those extra calories, because they're kind of empty calories, aren't I just spiking my glucose numbers and making that, because I was a little high in that. And isn't that going to just have set like a chain reaction of bad numbers? Things like
a large amount of sugar before you go to sleep might. If your blood glucose level is low, though, and that honestly, when your body asks for simple forms of sugar, that is like an immediate energy source that takes about 15 minutes to get into your bloodstream.
Right.
So I'm not a big believer in a sugar addiction, just because if your body's asking you for something sweet, it's usually doing that when your blood sugar is low and it wants an immediate source of energy.
Yeah, I mean, there's times when I feel like I'm hypoglycemic, just because I didn't eat for a long enough time, and say I have to go do a show, and I'm shaking, and I'm like, I better
That's
eat
sugar that your body wants.
I better eat some sugar right now, so I don't go on stage looking like a crackhead. and so I've always wondered, because sugar's been vilified so much, and I mean, it's like the devil now, and I do feel like it is I mean, I don't know where you stand on with like heart disease and things like that, but I feel like sugar contributes to everything from cancer to heart disease to a lot of bad things, inflammation everywhere. So I do try to stay away from it, but it's hard, like, eating that full meal or doing whatever it is. So, I mean, I don't know. What would you recommend then?
I mean, there are better choices to eat than like a tablespoon of sugar, but I think it's so important if sugar is something that is maybe uncomfortable, it's so important just to realize how your body sees sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's the same type of carbohydrates that it's going to get if you eat an apple, and most people aren't terrified of apples. Or if you eat white rice, your body's going to break it down to the exact same type of fuel that can be used as energy, primarily in your brain and your muscles. I think that later in the evening, an important thing to think is that if you haven't had a lot of carbs all day, that has not meant that your body has been like functioning without carbs. Usually that means that it's going to go into producing its own carbohydrates or utilizing what you have in storage. So glycogen is really our stored form of carbohydrate, and we store about 1,200 grams of carbs in our muscle and 600 in our liver, and our body is using that reserve until you can replenish it.
Mm-hmm.
So by the end of the day, if you have been active and you haven't been replenishing those carbohydrates that help to fuel your activity, that makes sense that like you kind of are feeling a little bit shaky, because now you're going to sleep, which is the longest period without food that we use throughout the night, or that we have throughout our whole day. Your body relies on those glycogen stores, primarily the ones in your liver, in order to provide you fuel through the evening, or through that long nighttime fast while you're sleeping. I mean, spiking your blood sugar constantly is not ideal. The best times that you could have something that's a simpler source of sugar is any time when you can be kind of up and moving around, can be structured activity or not. But the best thing that you can do to pull glucose or simple sugars out of your bloodstream is to use your muscles, exercise. If you have higher levels of blood glucose, like exercise is the best thing that you can do to help to yank some of that glucose out of your bloodstream, because your muscles are going to utilize it as fuel. If you take in a large amount of simple sugars and then go to sleep, or maybe like sit at your desk for hours, that puts a lot of responsibility back on your pancreas to excrete that insulin and yank it down.
Oh, so that makes sense. I've always felt like that. Like if you're a hardcore athlete that is performing at a certain level, doesn't like I didn't understand this, but it just seemed it was like a theory of mine, and I guess you kind of confirmed it's true. So if you're like a very serious athlete, if you're going to dose a bit of sugar before you do a work, it doesn't matter because it's going right out. You're using it, you're expending it. So
and it depends your exercise too. Like there are so many, the fuel sources that your muscles want to use based on your activity are very well researched. If you are doing a lower intensity activity, your body can utilize fat for that fuel perfectly fine. If you're in a high intensity activity though, like it requires about 10% more oxygen to use fat as fuel than carbohydrates. So if, again, I go back to, if you are already asking your body to do so much, why not just give it the fuel source that it can use the most effectively?
Mm-hmm.
For marathons, it's like 1% of fat is used as fuel. 99% comes from carbohydrates. So
Really?
anytime you're in a longer period of high intensity activity, simple carbohydrates are really the primary fuel source that your muscles want to utilize.
Oh wow! See, I did a long race once, like an ultra, and I felt like, because I was keeping my heart rate below 145 the whole time, trying to keep it there, that I was feeding off my fat storages. But we had a lot of big hills, and I would look during the hills, and I'd be up around 160, almost to 170 in my heart rate, and I'm like, this is where my sugar is getting depleted, and so I kept fueling the whole entire day with, I was eating those Stroop waffles, and I forget, I was getting about like 400 calories every single time, and I would eat, I think, 2 an hour. Maybe that's right, or maybe they were 200 calories each, and I was getting 400. I forget, but I felt this burst of energy after I'd eat it, like a real, like a lot of stuff people say, oh, this makes me feel good. I feel like you don't really see that much of a difference, but when you're doing a long run or a long ride or something, you feel it, like you just gave yourself like a shot of adrenaline. You're like, oh my God. And then 15 minutes later, it's gone.
Well, and if you remember, we talked about those 30-second to 2-minute bursts of, like, if you're doing a kind of steady state and then you have to go up a big hill, that's like kicking into a really high intensity period. Again, your body can function the best. You're going to reach like maximal levels of output if you have carbohydrates to fuel that. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge rabbit hole that I'd love to head down for sports, but I'd say the ideal amount of carbs per hour, if you're exercising up to like 2 hours, is about 60 grams of carbs per hour.
Okay.
If you're over a 2.5 hour mark, you really should try to get 90 grams per hour.
Wow.
And that's just because you are asking your body to do an insane amount of activity. You have completely depleted your glycogen stores. So any stored carbohydrates are no longer an option. You are running entirely based on the fuel that you give your body through simple carbohydrates at longer distances at higher intensities.
Interesting. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're exercising a lot, it's good to be taking in a good amount of carbohydrates that you are going to use. Not maybe good to take not good to eat a pint of ice cream like I did before I went to bed the other night. But
sometimes necessary.
Yeah. So sometimes it keeps my children alive.
Necessary.
Yeah, that was my stressor, because I don't drink as much as I'm like a 1 drink a week person. So, but I think that's my de-stress. It's like, all right, I'm gonna eat a pint of ice cream and I'll be okay when this is over. But I want to get back to the testosterone thing, because I think a lot of men, especially, that are trying to do their best at CrossFit, I'm not saying there's a lot of people that do steroids, but if they were doing steroids, anabolic steroids, or testosterone, which I believe is an anabolic steroid, is that going to show up in their blood test as free testosterone? Is that going to show up like with a high SBHG, or is it going to be low? Does it fix that problem?
So usually we'd see that in a couple of places. Even if it's like not back alley pig steroids, it's like recommended from your doctor as a topical cream.
Right.
We would expect, it might not be sky high elevated for testosterone or free T. Most like topical things are just trying to elevate people into a normal range, but you would see a really high SHBG. And if you think about it, it's because you are providing, like, your exogenous hormones or hormones from outside your body are now entering your body. So you need more of that transporter in order to deal with them. And the same thing's exactly true for females that are on hormonal birth control of any kind. If you're introducing more hormones to your body's going to respond by producing more of this transporter for them. We've also seen testosterone can drastically increase your HSCRP, which is that non-specific marker of inflammation, can also mess up your lipids or your cholesterol levels pretty badly as well.
So basically, looking at my blood report, it looks like I'm one of those dudes that just juices
not
all
necessarily.
the time.
I would, your inflammation's great. I would have expected that to be off the charts. The first time that I ever saw this was maybe like 5 years ago when I first started working for Inside Tracker. Testosterone was off the charts. SHBG was through the roof. The inflammation was like, we couldn't even register it anymore. And it ended up that the guy was like, yeah, I take steroids. I'm a bikini competitor. And I was like, stop doing that. Look at what is happening to you. You can have a heart attack tomorrow.
I don't understand it. And, you know, I'm friends with Chris Bell, who made the documentary Bigger, Stronger, Faster. And, you know, I watched the documentary and I'm like, this is a narrative that, and I love the guy and I think he's a great guy, but it's a narrative that I feel like he created to justify the use of it. When, you know, and say, oh, there's not really any health problems associated with them. Like, I find that really hard to believe, especially if you're saying your inflammation goes up. I mean, inflammation seems like the worst thing to be going on in your body. And if you're taking something that's going to create inflammation, I mean, that's...
Yeah. I mean, muscles at any cost does not sit well with me. Testosterone levels that are super high at any cost, what is the point of that if you are going to negatively impact your health for the long haul?
Yeah.
Especially if you're increasing your risk of having a heart attack, which the majority of Americans die from. It's like 25% of people in the US die from heart attacks. Inflammation is a significant factor in people that have those.
So I have a friend that has lung cancer that's spread, metastasized, and he was taking testosterone his entire life, like exogenous testosterone in it. And I've often wondered, because none of his doctors talked about that with him. And when we were talking about it right after he was diagnosed, the testosterone thing came up and I went, did you tell your doctor that? And he was like, yeah, I think we went through it. And I'm like, could that have something to do with the fact that, you know, like the growth of the tumors or something like that? Because, you know, you're basically like feeding everything to grow faster. Couldn't that be your number one problem? And he's like, oh, the doctors don't seem to think so. And I was like, all right, you know, they know way better than I do, but it just would seem to me that that's a good theory.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an oncologist,
Right.
but I would say that inflammation in theory is something that you want in small amounts that your body gets used to figuring out and working through. Like, natural inflammation happens because our body's trying to protect us from something. Most of us have an inflammatory response that lasts maybe a couple of days, and then our immune system helps us to deal with that. But that chronic inflammation that sticks around all the time, like, inflammation typically causes a little bit more inflammation. So, like, ideally, that is not a cycle that can be allowed to continue to snowball. Because even if you start with a sprained ankle, the majority of that inflammation is there, but you still have these inflammatory cytokines or compounds in your body that are circulating your whole body. So it doesn't necessarily stay there. And I should say that that example of that guy on steroids, he was definitely back alley injections. It wasn't something that he got through his doctor, like a nice manageable amount in a cream. Most testosterone, who knows? I would say that you probably aren't going to notice a really big difference, but to some extent, it could increase inflammation levels. That's something that your doctor's probably also monitoring if you're taking this under a doctor's care.
Okay, so it wouldn't be a podcast if we didn't talk about COVID.
Okay.
Would there be any markers in your blood work that would say, oh, this is indicative of having the COVID virus?
No.
Nothing.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, your white blood cells may be high, your inflammation might be high, but those could be high from if you had a sinus infection, those would also be really high. I will say that there's been a lot of research about vitamin D. Individuals with lower levels of vitamin D that do get COVID and end up in the hospital tend to have worse outcomes than those that have adequate amounts of vitamin D. We test vitamin D, not that we would use this in any way to diagnose if someone has COVID,
Sure.
But anything that you'd see here would support overall, like, general health or general immune system well-being, I'll say. It wouldn't be anything that could specifically pinpoint
So I
COVID.
heard a doctor talking about the vitamin D levels and how important it was to have them, to have good levels during COVID. And they were saying something like, best way to get it's through the sun. And then there's other ways of supplementing or getting it through your foods. But I think they said if you live anywhere north of Atlanta,
Hmm.
that you're not going to get enough sun for like 9 months of the year, which I thought
Yeah.
was really interesting. I was like,
So it's above the 37th parallel in
okay,
the US, which is basically San Francisco to the Mason-Dixon line between Maryland and Pennsylvania.
okay,
Anything above that, typically it's between like maybe October or November, depending on how far north you are, until April. And that's just because how our skin produces vitamin D. It uses cholesterol to do that. Basically, with UV rays on our skin, that cholesterol gets converted into a form of vitamin D. And in those more northern latitudes, as basically the sun or the earth tilts away from the sun, I'm not a geologist if this would be the right person, but basically the UV rays aren't strong enough to elicit that response in our skin to produce that vitamin D. But it's not just that. If you are an older person, it becomes much more difficult to produce vitamin D in your skin. If you have more melanin in your skin, so you have darker skin tone, it's going to require a lot longer time period in the sun. If you never go outside without sunscreen, any SPF over 15, you won't produce vitamin D with. If you are wearing long sleeves and a hat and pants all the time, you're not going to be able to produce vitamin D from that either. Even if you live in Florida, we've worked with a lot of people that live in Florida. Our triathletes, our baseball players, they're constantly outside, but they're never outside without sunscreen or long sleeves on. You're just not able to produce vitamin D through SPF 15 or higher, or if you have any sort of clothing on.
interesting. So is that something that shows up a lot on your tests that people with low vitamin D? And then
Yeah.
do you recommend getting more sun, or do you say like if you're in one of these areas like Pennsylvania, Maryland, and North, get supplement?
So it depends. That's one of the questions on our intake questionnaire is if you spend at least 20 minutes a day with like unfiltered sunshine. Um, Again, most people don't go outside without
Yeah.
sunscreen on their bodies right now. 20 minutes without sunscreen on your body is not going to drastically increase your risk of getting some sort of skin cancer unless you are on the sun, maybe. But so if you say that you're already doing that, then you won't get that as a recommendation. Also, depending on how low your level is, it's also just incredibly difficult if you are severely deficient in vitamin D to like pick yourself up out of this ditch with just sitting in the sun for 20 minutes a day. Food sources of vitamin D are pretty poor. Most dairy is fortified with vitamin D. Other than that, fatty fish can provide some types of mushrooms that have been put underneath UV lamps in order to kill any sort of bacteria has some, but that's kind of it. Food is just not a good source of vitamin D. Cod liver oil supplements can provide some. For the most part, though, some people really do just need a supplement, but it's so important to know where your blood level is before you start taking a supplement. It's a fat soluble vitamin, which means it can accumulate in your body. It can be toxic if you take too much vitamin D for too long of a period of time. So it's important to know the level you should take initially, also when to stop.
Yeah, interesting, because I heard too much vitamin D can cause kidney stones, and there is this like you know safe space to be in, and that was one of the things I was very happy to see, that my vitamin D levels were normal. I surf a lot, but I wouldn't say I do it every day. I mean, there's days, and I live in California in the sun, but there are days where I'm just like, I wasn't in the sun at all today. But then there are
Sure.
days, when I go surfing, I pretty much just cover my face, and I've got a wetsuit on a lot of times. But I will say sometimes I'm only going out for an hour.
Mm.
I'm not going to cover myself, and because I feel like I need to get that sun. So I found that that was a very good thing that made me feel good about the vitamin D, and then vitamin C is something that I used to supplement constantly, like a high level, like 1,000 milligrams, I think, a day.
Sure.
And I've read so many studies that say that doesn't do anything for you. And then other studies that say if you exercise a ton or you beat your body up, that it is very important that you get those high levels.
Yeah, so it depends. I think like those vitamin C like powders that you can take for the most part aren't protective against you being sick. Maybe there's some anecdotal evidence that your cold lasts for 3 days instead of 4 days. Most people though are just taking a vitamin C supplement and then peeing most of it out.
Right.
It's a water soluble vitamin that your body doesn't store. So once it uses what it can for the day, no extra is really reserved. There is research though that vitamin C, if you are engaging in a lot of activity, in particular high intensity or like highly damaging activity, vitamin C can help in that muscle recovery process. And that's because vitamin C is an antioxidant. Its role is really to another antioxidant, vitamin E, basically helps to protect our cell membranes, which is just the outside of all of our cells. And it's constantly working to fend off things that can basically chew through that cell membrane and kill the cell. Vitamin C's role is really to just regenerate vitamin C so it can keep going. So if you're doing a lot of higher intensity exercise, and exercise is great, but it really is for most people the most stressful situation that their body will be in, unless you've had some sort of like serious health issue. It's a stressor to our system, which is why it's important to take rest. But that accumulates a lot of basically free radicals, just like things that happen as our body produces energy in order to fuel that workout. So vitamin C can be very helpful there, just in helping your body protect against that inflammation that naturally is going to come from exercise by regenerating that other vitamin E. I'd say though, eating fresh fruits and vegetables is enough.
Okay.
We survived a really long time before any type of supplement in the world was available. Yes, we're living much longer now, but vitamin C is a water soluble vitamin. So you want to consume it fresh. Ideally, if you have to cook it, it's for a very, very short period of time. It's never boiled or roasted. But having, again, a mixture of cooked and fresh veggies in your diet every day is a great way to make sure you're getting enough vitamins in.
I take it liposomally. Does that make a difference?
What does that mean?
It's the way it's delivered, lipospheric or liposomally. It's like it's basically so you don't flush it out. Like it stays in your system. Maybe it's a gimmick, maybe it's not. It's expensive as shit.
I mean, how your body stores vitamin C, it doesn't store it. Fat soluble vitamins get stored in your fat and your liver. There's no organ or mechanism necessarily to store vitamin C in your body.
Okay, the last subject I want to go on, I should have probably done first, and I don't want to keep you too long. So, cholesterol.
Yep.
Cholesterol, I mean, because I did have a little bit of a high LDL, but I had good HDL and good triglycerides. I had heard that there's like an equation you can do that kind of figures that out for you. And sure. I don't know, do you guys go by that, or do you go by, hey, your LDL's too high, you got to bring it down?
So the like HDL to LDL ratio or LDL to HDL ratio is out there. I will say there's like good science behind it, but we also tell you what your actual level is. And everything that we do on Inside Tracker has been supported by copious amounts of research. LDL on its own is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, which is why we treat it as an independent biomarker. This is one that for some people it's very controversial, but LDL is the strongest indicator for whether or not someone is likely to have cardiovascular disease or any type of heart events. So that's why we treat it very separately and take it really seriously. Yes, if you also have a higher level of HDL, it is much better and is cardioprotective versus a high level of LDL and a low level of HDL. Basically, HDL goes out, picks up cholesterol, transports it back to the liver, where hopefully it gets released from the body and doesn't go back into circulation as this type of more harmful cholesterol. So that ratio, the higher your HDL and the lower your LDL is really the best thing that you can have as far as these two numbers go.
Okay. There was kind of what I really want to know is, for the majority of the people listening to the show are CrossFitters. Is there one major thing that you see with them that they could do differently besides, like I heard you mention, don't push it, like don't push your heart rate up, every day, that kind of take days off from that. Is there anything else you see that, like, CrossFitters have been raised on this paleo diet of eating a lot of meat and a lot of this, or, high fats. Is there any kind of recommendation that you can, as a broad kind of general recommendation, to make to CrossFitters?
Yeah, I would say incorporate carbohydrates, in particular soluble fiber. For the life of me, I cannot figure out why we would want to follow the diet of someone that had a life expectancy of 32, which is what most of our ancestors had, of eating a largely protein or animal-based diet. To say that our bodies have not evolved at all in 100,000 years or whatever that is, to adapt to the type of foods that are available. In particular, the longest living cultures in the world are ones that rely pretty heavily on carbohydrates. So in particular for activity, carbs are super, super important. That's the fuel source that your muscles want to use. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to eat like candy constantly. But that soluble fiber is another really important component that really you can only find in carbohydrates or chia seeds.
What are some examples of soluble fiber?
So how I like to explain soluble fiber is it's the type of fiber that swells when it comes into contact with water. So if you visualize putting oats, chia seeds, rice, beans, even some types of nuts in water, when they swell, that's really the effect of soluble fiber. Soluble fiber just means that it swells in contact with water, or can absorb or dissolve in water. The other type of fiber, insoluble fiber, is what most CrossFitters are getting plenty of. And that's the type of fiber that you get from fruits and vegetables. It's great. It has a lot of vitamins, lots of fiber to move things through, lots of water, but it doesn't have the same impact on your cholesterol levels that soluble fiber does.
Interesting. That is really interesting. I didn't know that. The only time I've ever focused on that was, this is kind of gross. I had a bacterial infection or a parasite or something that the doctor couldn't even detect. And it had made me sick for like 3 weeks of like violently ill, and couldn't, my stomach, my gut was just so messed up. And somewhere I read was you need more insoluble fiber. So, because I was trying to eat like chicken and rice or whatever would like settle my stomach, or that couldn't create havoc if there was inflammation in my stomach, whatever it was. And when I started eating insoluble fiber, it's like it repaired and made me better. And it was just eating like a lot of broccoli and cauliflower and stuff like that. So I don't know how. I mean, I just read everything and tried everything, and that was my solution. So I was like, okay.
I will also say that insoluble fiber is not a carbohydrate. There is a very popular CrossFitter that uses cabbage as his primary carbohydrate. Cabbage is not a carb. Your body cannot use fiber. Fiber is an indigestible carbohydrate. Therefore, your body can't use it as energy. So do not count insoluble.
I did not know. That's so important. I had no idea of that. Who's that important CrossFitter?
I'm not saying.
Come on.
They have lots of videos out there, which is how I learned about it. But
interesting. So everybody go
vegetables
Google.
Unless it's a starchy vegetable, is not a good source of carbs for your workouts.
Okay, so the sweet potato, the potato, I think white potatoes have gotten such a bad rap, and you look at the amount of potassium in them, and
great source of potassium.
Yeah,
don't deep fry them.
I was just gonna say, just eat regular one. Go back to your meat and potatoes. Well, thank you so much for everything. I mean, this was like such an education. I could talk to you for 12 hours and go down all these wormholes, because I love to nerd out on it. But that's what Inside Tracker's for. It's the best way. Like I said, DEXA scans and Inside Tracker to get your markers and have something to work with. If you're a trainer, I can't believe every trainer doesn't do this. Like, I hear of some guys taking measurements, or some guys, weighing people. Get a DEXA scan and get blood work done. and then let them do the work for you. Let those markers, let the nutritionists do all that stuff for you, because I was really impressed with how it was broken down, and so much that I didn't know, and so much that I need to work on. So how can people, other than just going to insidetracker.com, that's I guess that's the best way. And it just makes me feel good to know that someone as educated and knowledgeable about this is behind the advice and the recommendations. So I really appreciate you and your work.
Of course. I am one small piece of a massive team of scientists that are just very passionate about people knowing information that can improve their health before it becomes something that requires a much larger intervention. Yeah. And that's really what our founder's goal was, is to give people information that they can use that will really lengthen their life and prevent them from having any sort of debilitating chronic disease.
Where are the owners? Where did they come out of, or the founder?
So our founder, Gil Blander, he is got his PhD at MIT, or came from MIT. He did his postdoc at MIT. But our scientific advisory board is largely MIT and Harvard. We're located in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, knowing that, those guys don't know anything. I mean, can you pick some good schools?
And Tufts.
Tufts okay.
Has a really good nutrition program. It's like a very, very good nutrition graduate program. And a lot of our advisors are also from there.
Well, I thank you for your work. I'll work on it. Got to get that sex hormone binding globulin. Got to really work on that. You know what? I want you to explain it, and it's the last thing I'm going to ask you to do. The coconut oil. When you and I were talking about coconut oil, and I said that I eat a lot of it, and you were like, that could be the cause of your LDL being high. And coconut oil has been, I'll give you a funny little story. A friend of mine who's a cardiologist said to me one time about diet and nutrition, he's not a big believer. He said, you can change your diet, but you can't change your genes. Mm-hmm. And I was talking about my dad had to be put on a statin. I said, my dad's parents lived to be 96 years old, both of them. I said, I don't believe like somehow something's gone astray that's needed him to get on a statin. And my guess would be lifestyle, food. And he's like, you can change your diet. You can't change it, blah, blah. And about like 2 years later, he calls me. He's like, what do you know of this coconut oil? He's like, I'm thinking about cooking with it. And I'm like, I don't know. You're a cardiologist. Like, why don't you know this? And he was like, yeah, I'm hearing lots of good things. And at the time, I was like, yeah, sure. It's great. It's the blah, blah, blah. You should be cooking with it all the time. Then you and I had a discussion. You're like, nah, cut it out.
Yeah. I mean, my pet passion project is on cholesterol, in particular, just encouraging people to try things in their diet before they start a medication that can absolutely be incredibly helpful, but that they will be on for the rest of their lives. And coconut oil, I swear the person that marketed coconut oil and bacon as health foods should be the most sought after marketing guru ever. Coconut oil is large. I think it got super popular with these MCT or medium chain triglycerides that coconut oil does have, but it is a small fraction of the amount of fats that you find in coconut oil. The majority of fats that you find there are saturated fats, which are the exact same type of fats that you find in animal products. Mm-hmm. So it's very similar to cooking with butter. Mm-hmm. If you cannot find medium chain triglycerides in isolation in the real world, other than in a supplement form. But essentially, yeah, go ahead.
So the MCTs are good if you can get them in a supplement form. You just don't want them mixed in with butter and coconut oil.
Yeah, I mean, basically, medium chain triglycerides, our body just absorbs them a little bit differently than other fats. Whether or not they aren't necessarily atherogenic, meaning that they're not necessarily bad for your heart health. I don't think it's worth a super expensive supplement. You could just put some olive oil in there, and the same thing would really be happening.
So cooking, use olive oil at low heat?
Yeah, olive oil or avocado oil would be the two best options. Olive oil has a much lower smoke point, meaning that you don't want to go too high. If you're cooking anything that's super high, avocado oil can go up to 500 degrees. Yeah, and coconut oil, it's the same thing as butter. Like I like eggs cooked in butter. That
Yeah.
I'm not making it as like a health decision though.
Right.
Like I'm not
Okay.
being like I'm gonna be so healthy because I'm putting eggs in butter. Another thing on butter is just that ghee is also butter. Pasture raised butter is also butter.
Yeah.
Which is fine every now and then,
Right.
but it's not necessarily like the healthiest
Option.
option that you
Gotcha.
can have, especially if you're trying to lower your cholesterol. If
Okay.
you have high cholesterol in particular.
Okay. Honey, throw the butter out now. I abuse butter. I admit it. My
Butter's delicious. Like it's exactly what we want to taste, and it's fine every now and then.
It's the greatest thing ever. But butter and bacon.
Which are fine every now and then, but should not be in there all the time, in particular if you're trying to work on heart health.
Should I be cooking my bacon in butter?
I've seen it. My grandfather loves a good slab of butter on top of his steak.
Oh, I do too. And back to the steak thing, and I promise this is the last question. When you have the options, and it's like 20% fat or 10%. The other day I was looking and I was buying grass-fed meat. I forget if it was bison or ground beef, but it was like one was 10%, one was 20%. You should opt for the 10%, right? Because that is the saturated fat, right?
Theoretically, yeah. I mean, if you're eating meat all the time, yes, that would be ideal, because saturated fat's what you really want to focus on for preventing your LDL and the specific type of LDL that can be damaging. If you don't eat meat that often, like a hamburger once a week with 20% is totally fine.
Okay.
But yeah, I like to think of it as like overall over the course of a week, how many of those higher saturated fat things have you incorporated? If it's just one or two, like fine, have ice cream 1 or 2 nights a week. If it is red meat 6 times, the most fatty cheese you can find most nights a week, lots of ice cream, only cooking with butter and lots of bacon, which is the diet for many people. Probably best to cut out or cut back on some of those things.
Gotcha. Well, this has been awesome. I appreciate your time. I'm sure the listeners will love it too. You dispelled a lot of things for me, and also got me. I mean, with Inside Tracker, I have a whole new. It's dialing in. So I'm really excited to be making right decisions with the science behind it, rather than what I've heard and anecdotal evidence and stuff like that. So anybody that's listening, go to InsideTracker.com, sign up, do it. You can do your DNA or you get your DNA tested, and also your what is it, your biological age too? Or
inner age. We're launching a new inner age in the next couple of weeks, which we're super excited about.
Oh, I got mine done.
You'll still have this new calculation. It'll show you what.
Oh, and I was heartbroken. I was expected to say like, Eddie, you're like a 25-year-old man, and it was like, I was like a year younger than I really am. I was like, oh, great.
So good.
Yeah. Oh well. Well, thank you very much for doing the show, and maybe we'll do I'll never do a half triathlon. Never. I have to do the Ironman or nothing.
Please eat your carbohydrates while on the bike.
Oh, I will.
Good.
When I did my ultra marathon, I ate 2 In-N-Out doubles at the 50-mile mark.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And then kept going?
Oh, what I have, I had 18 more miles after that.
Yikes.
Yeah. I think I didn't eat enough the whole time. So.
There you go.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I appreciate it so much. It was awesome talking to you.
Thanks
Guys,
for having me.
Check them out, InsideTracker.com. And do you have anything else that you like, a blog that you do or anything that you would like to plug?
Sure. My Instagram is lower.cholesterol.nutrition. It's again, a passion project of mine due to a family history of it, and just letting people know there's options other than statins out there.
I'm going to look at that today.
Awesome.
Thanks, Ashley. And thank you guys for listening. You know what to do. Go to iTunes, rate, review, and comment. And all these episodes are now on YouTube. So check them out at youtube.com/WODcast podcast. Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.